Thank you so much for joining the Gains for Girls podcast. Gosh, we were just talking about how really the first time I met you and shared a stage with you was 2 years ago, which is mind-blowing for me personally, all that's happened in my life, but, broader what's been going on around the country in these past 2 years. But in those 2 years, as of course, I have grown to understand, to become more aware of the things plaguing this country, the cultural chaos that surrounds us. You have been someone that is a role model. You're a role model for me. You're a strong leader. You're a strong female leader, which is few and far between. And so I could not be more grateful for you and helping today and announcing the very, very exciting news. And the news being the Riley Gaines Stand With Women Scorecard. This is a first of its kind resource that tells everyday Americans who stands with women and who does not. It scores every single candidate for federal office on whether they stand with women, meaning that they intend to or have already support legislation that preserves female opportunities in private spaces. Standing with women and girls should not be a partisan issue. But unfortunately, at least in terms of our elected representation, it does seem to be something that falls on party lines. But here we are where some candidates, again, simply don't consider women. They're okay. But I believe accountability is key. And so, Tulsi, I wanted to start by asking you, why do you think this scorecard is important and necessary?
It's sad that we live in a country where we can't just make the safe assumption that our elected leaders are going to look out for our children, the most vulnerable among us. That even those politicians who stand on stages and tout their support for women and equality and fairness in life, in the workplace, in sports, and in education, when it comes down to this very simple issue of biological males competing against biological females in sports, and therefore completely undermining the heart and the core of why Title IX was passed in the first place, and what has been the reason for progress for so many women and girls for over 5 decades. This is not a safe assumption to make, which is why it's so important, Riley, that you're doing what you're doing, that you're putting out this scorecard so that voters who are just trying to get by every day, or trying to raise their kids in a safe and loving home, and trying to provide for them and wanting the very best for their children. Oftentimes they don't have time to dig into, the layers of hypocrisy that unfortunately exist in our politics today. And I can guarantee you that even as every single elected Democrat in federal office has been silent on standing up for fairness for women and girls in sports and education, I'm sure there are many of them who would be very afraid of their voters actually learning about that truth. So my hope is that with your scorecard, and thank you for stepping up to lead this effort at such a critical time. We are about 6 weeks until the election, and early voting has already begun. So, the success of our democracy is based on an informed electorate. Our ability to make up our own mind for ourselves. But in order to do that, we actually have to have the facts and the truth. And your scorecard and pushing this out there to voters across the country about federal candidates and federal office holders is better going to equip voters to recognize who is standing up for my young daughter, who wants the best for her and her future, and who is turning their back on our young women and girls at such a critical time.
I totally agree. And you mentioned, this doesn't seem to be something that Democrats want to reveal their voting records, whether it's, again, who is running for president. I was pretty bummed personally at the debate recently. The gender ideology movement didn't get brought up once. I believe this was, of course, strategic because Kamala Harris and the moderators who were working with her and against President Trump, they know this is not a winning issue. They know this is not an issue that polls in their favor. Could you imagine if Montanans really began to understand that Senator John Tester really voted in favor of eliminating equal opportunities for their daughters? They would be appalled. That doesn't represent Montana values. And you mentioned deception as well. You know, Democrats, they claim to be the party of and for women. explicitly pretty much referring to abortion, dismembering babies and aborting these babies. Not kind of getting off topic, but they speak of healthcare freedom. Where was that healthcare freedom in 2020 and 2021? No, these were the same tyrants who were firing healthcare workers and military service members and teachers if they weren't complying with these autocratic mandates. But nonetheless, as we said, again, this is something that tends to fall on the party lines. Every incumbent Republican at the federal level stands with women thus far, and every incumbent Republican is Riley Gaines approved. That means that every incumbent Democrat running for re-election at the federal level currently fails the scorecard. Every Democrat running for re-election is not Riley Gaines approved. And so national polling, it consistently shows that 70% plus, I believe that number is higher, 70% plus of Americans believe that women's sports should be for women only. I imagine you have unique perspective on this, given your history, your former political affiliation. Why is it that Democrats will not stand with women on these common sense issues?
Riley, I introduced, I think it was the first piece of legislation in Congress called the Protect Women's Sports Act. It was a bipartisan piece of legislation I introduced with my friend, then Representative, now Senator Mark Wayne Mullen, representing Oklahoma. He has young girls who are competitive wrestlers. He has young boys as well who are competitive wrestlers. But he understood from a very personal standpoint why this was so important, because he was thinking about his daughters and the competitions that they would go to and the wrestling matches that they would have and their ability to reach the highest heights of their chosen sport. I have many friends who are in this exact same situation. So we introduced this legislation while I was still in Congress, Protect Women's Sports Act, that was less than a half a page long. It was a very simple piece of legislation that restated the intent of Title IX, that it had to do with biological sex. Plain and simple, something that should not be controversial when you look at the objective truth of these differences between men and women. And once again, why those legislators, led by Democrats, may I say, over 50 years ago, who pushed for the passage of Title IX. This is why they did this, because they recognized this very difference and how unfair women and girls were being treated in sports and education and not having the same opportunities as these boys and men. The level of backlash, hate, both directly to my face, through emails, through propaganda, media stories, was astronomical. It was incredible to see how immediately this radical Democrat elite voice came out in unison against a very simple piece of legislation called the Protect Women's Sports Act. Needless to say, a lot of my former Democrat colleagues no longer spoke to me or came and gave me an earful on the House floor during votes. But at no time then and no time since have they actually addressed the heart of this issue. When they are questioned on it, as you know very well, their response very often is, this only affects a very, very, very small number of people. Aren't you more concerned about being inclusive and being welcoming? They never actually address the physical harm that's coming to those who are competing in sports like mixed martial arts. We've even seen in volleyball and some other sports that has come to girls in this and women in this situation. What to speak of the lack of fairness, and it's happening in states all across the country. So again, I laugh a little bit when I hear they're immediately trying to squash this as though it's not an issue at all, even as they claim to be the party that wants to protect the American people from misinformation and disinformation. They are trying to hide the truth about the consequences of their position. I can't logically explain to you, Riley, why even some of my former colleagues who I know have young daughters are not, they don't have the conviction to stand up even for them, even for their own children. The only thing that we can point to is, quite frankly, the level of fear and self-censorship that the leadership of today's Democratic Party has created. When I joined the Democratic Party over 20 years ago, it was a big open tent party. Democrats could come together and have strong disagreements about very, very important issues and move forward and be more inclusive, as they say. But today's Democrat Party, it is, you will toe the line, you will comply. This is the party position. And if you don't, we will come after you. We will target you, smear you, cancel you, try to destroy your political career. And they don't have to wonder how they'll do it, because they see how they've done it to people like me and others who've had the courage to come forward and say, hey, right is right, truth is truth, and I stand with women and girls. And that's what you and I did when we first met. It was the 50th anniversary of the passage of Title IX. 50 years of women and girls benefiting because of the work that many leaders, including strong Democrat leaders, including a former congresswoman from Hawaii, Patsy Mink, what they fought hard for enabled incredible personal and professional achievement for women and girls over 5 decades.